Hello and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about dementia, a disease that afflicts 50 million people across the world.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. 50 million people live with dementia worldwide, and there is no effective treatment for it. Our guests will bring you up to speed on what's new and what's next in understanding and combating dementia. With me in the studio today are Dr. Eliezer Masliah, Director of the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute on Aging, and Dr. Marilyn S, Director of the Division of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins University. So thank you both for joining us today. Let's start with a video from NIA about the process of aging.
At some point, we are all going to age. Today, the population in the United States and the world is older than ever before. By 2020, for the first time in history, there will be more people over age 65 than under 5. In the U.S., healthy aging is now a particular challenge. While trends in life expectancy have improved over time, not all older adults are aging in good health. That is why here at NIA, we support and conduct cutting-edge research to extend the healthy and active years of life. Reflecting the enormous effect of aging on all aspects of our lives, NIA's portfolio of research is comprehensive and varied. Check out our website at www.nia.nih.gov.
Great, thank you for that video. Dr. Elbert, let's start with an overview of dementia.
So I think the most common question that I get asked when I speak to a lay audience is what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? I hope that we'll get that straight today. So dementia just means that there's a gradual progressive decline in mental abilities until people are essentially unable to care for themselves. Technically, we define it as 2 impairments in mental abilities, but the key is that there's a decline from prior function to the point where people are no longer able to manage independently. So that's just a syndrome. It's just a general description. And today we'll be talking a lot about Alzheimer's disease because it's the most common form of dementia. We think that of all the people who die with dementia, about 70% of them have Alzheimer's disease in their brain, along with other pathologies which we'll be talking about. So this is an enormously common problem. We estimate that at least 1 in 4 people over the age of 85 have dementia. It might be as common as 1 in 2. And of course, it's a disease that affects more people as they get older, and this is a population that's aging. And so that's why we're so concerned about it, because the number of people being affected by dementia is increasing, and it's an enormous burden. Not only is the person affected, but then somebody in their family, maybe multiple people, have to help to care for them. So it's an enormous socioeconomic problem as well as a cultural problem.
And Dr. Masliah, what would you add to that?
Yeah, definitely. As Dr. Albert mentioned, Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia, but we have also other common causes of dementia, like dementia with Lewy bodies that is accompanied by movement disorders, Parkinson's-like, what we call frontotemporal dementia, which has also a clinical component with psychiatric problems and hallucinations and other issues. And we also have vascular dementia, which is the type of dementia that is related to blood vessel damage, stroke, and also has its own manifestations. Here is worth mentioning also that as individuals develop dementia at older ages, these conditions could actually interact with each other, and we could see actually mixed versions of dementia, which probably we'll talk more about later on.
And while we were chatting before the webinar, you mentioned the economic cost.
Yes, it is estimated that in the U.S., for the federal government, the cost of caring of patients with dementia is about $200 billion a year. But that doesn't
B with the for billion.
But it doesn't take into account what it costs actually out of the pocket for many of the families to take care of those individuals, as well as to private and other sectors. So it really is incredibly complex and large problem economically, but also, of course, in terms of family and the pain caused by these terrible conditions.
Dr. Albert?
Well, in the video that we saw, you were talking about the enormous numbers of people who are going to be living to be over the age of 65. And this is a disease that disproportionately affects that population, which is going to be growing. So unless we can find better treatments, the healthcare system, the way it is right now, is not going to be able to deal with it.
And let's talk about the spectrum of cognitive impairment as Alzheimer's disease progresses.
So one of the things that we've come to realize recently, which of course we maybe should have realized before, is that this pathology starts when people are cognitively normal. So we now know that there are some people who are older. When they die, they have Alzheimer pathology in their brain and other pathologies related to these other types of dementias that Dr. Masliah was talking about. And so it begins when people are normal and then spreads through the brain. And there's a phase where people have mild symptoms. They're not demented, but they're beginning to have more and more difficulty in daily life. So for example, in Alzheimer's disease, what you see is that people might repeat themselves more frequently, forget conversations, have more trouble keeping track of appointments, more trouble shopping, all those kinds of things that we need good memory in order to manage. They're still able to adapt to these problems, and so we don't say they have dementia. We say they have what we call in the United States mild cognitive impairment. But it's the interim phase of this disease. And then as those symptoms get worse and the disease spreads in the brain, then people become demented. So they're no longer able to manage on their own, and more mental abilities get affected.
Would you add anything to that?
I think that covered it fairly well.
And I think we see on the slide that you see the terms that people are using now to talk about these phases of the disease. So when Dr. Masliah and I began working in the field, when we said Alzheimer's disease, we were only talking about people with dementia. But now, as I say, we know that it begins when people are normal. And that phase we call the preclinical phase, because people don't have symptoms, but they have the pathology. And then this prodromal or mild cognitive impairment phase.
And the MCI, again, define that for us.
So it's that phase where I was saying people have mild symptoms, but they're able to adapt to them. So they might be more forgetful, they might have trouble paying their bills, they might have a little bit trouble preparing meals, but they're able to manage on their own.
And what does MCI stand for, the acronym?
Mild cognitive impairment.
Great, our journalists need to know that, right. Dr. Masliah, tell us about the role of the National Institute on Aging and the National Alzheimer's Project.
Sure. The National Institute on Aging is part of the National Institutes of Health, which is the public, federally funded branch of government involved in funding research for biomedical disorders. NIA is primarily focused on aging, promoting research on healthy aging, resilience, and also Alzheimer's disease. We have research going on inside of NIA, primarily in the Baltimore area, but also in Bethesda. But we also fund, and actually most of the resources we have go to fund laboratories around the U.S. and even in some places around the world. And particular, for example, the laboratory of Dr. Alberts, the Alzheimer Research Center is one of the 30 centers that are NIA funded for research on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. We found a number of other programs, including clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, basic research on the genetics and the etiology for Alzheimer's disease. And what is really extraordinary, and we're living a golden era in research on Alzheimer's disease, is because we have now a blueprint for research on Alzheimer's disease. This is what we call the National Plan to Address Alzheimer's Disease, which is it was signed into law in 2011, and we started to receive considerable increases in funding for this research beginning in 2016. I arrived to NIA in 2016, and at the time our funding was about $600 million a year for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia research. Now we are at $2.3 billion a year. For FY19, Congress gave another $450 million for this research. So the research has, the level of funding for this research has more than triplicated, which provides tremendous resources for the community to conduct this research and hopefully approach the goal of the national plan, that is to find a cure for the disease by the year 2025. So the clock is ticking, as you can imagine. We're under a lot of pressure to really advance the national plan. And I want to emphasize that the national plan not only covers Alzheimer's disease, but also, as I mentioned, the so-called related dementias that includes frontotemporal dementia, vascular dementia, and dementia with the Lewy bodies. So we're working in a coordinated fashion with many groups to advance the plan.
And for journalists watching this webinar, are the 30 NIA-funded research labs listed on your website, so if they want to localize their coverage?
Yes.
And it's great that you've had this tremendous increase in your funding, and you said you have congressional support. Would you describe that? Because that's a pretty interesting, what Washingtonians would call a workaround from the normal authorization process, the budgeting process.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have very strong bipartisan support, and we're really very thankful and very excited.
But you're funded outside of the regular NIH funding process, right?
Well, the allocation is part of the NIH, but we have what is called a bypass budget. So we inform, every year we inform Congress as to what has been done with the funds, what progress has been made, what resources have been funded, but also what are the needs for the following year. And this is based on communication with the scientific community, who tells us what are the gaps, what are the needs, and that becomes what we call recommendations that we then turn into milestones. And those milestones are priced by our team, determine how much will be needed to accomplish those milestones. And that is transmitted to Congress into a document that is actually made publicly available. Every year we have this Alzheimer's disease bypass budget document that we've been publishing since I believe 2015, where we make all these requests publicly available. So this actually goes to Congress. It goes also, of course, to the Office of the President and HHS, but goes to Congress for consideration, and the allocations are pretty much based on that.
I'll make sure that we point the journalists to the milestones.
Yeah, the milestones are made publicly available, as well as the bypass budget, and basically everything that we're funding, all the research that we're funding, is also made publicly available. We have we created a web search system called iDrop, and I can explain what that is, but where you can actually see everything that we're funding is totally transparent.
And I would just add to that I think that the reason that this is a bipartisan issue is that the Congress not only recognizes what a terrible problem dementia is, but we haven't had a new drug approved for any form of dementia since 2003. So here we are with a growing problem and no truly effective treatments. So everybody feels a great desperation to really make a difference. And as Dr. Masliah was saying, find an effective treatment by 2025.
And so one of these NIA-funded laboratories is at Johns Hopkins. Can you tell us what they're doing there, and is there other work outside of the NIA scope?
Well, we're very fortunate to have an Alzheimer Center. Ours is one of the oldest. It's been funded for over 35 years. That, of course, you might imagine, means that we fund a range of research. So our purpose is to provide the infrastructure and to help as many investigators as possible to work. We don't provide all the money. A lot of the money, as you heard, was coming from the federal government. But we try to help young people with training. We try to help people who need to design clinical trials. We try to develop new ways of looking at the disease that can help us identify it early. So one of the major interests at Johns Hopkins is in this preclinical phase of the disease that I mentioned before, the phase when people are normal but have pathology developing in the brain. Because we believe that if there was an effective treatment approved tomorrow, the time to use it would be early rather than when people have dementia. And so we're trying very hard to find out how to identify people when they're normal who are at risk for developing the disease.
And how do you get people to sign up for preclinical
So
trials?
in our case, one of the studies that I lead is a big longitudinal study where we have followed people for over 20 years. We have about 350 people in it right now. And 75% of them have a family history of dementia, and that's what motivates them. So they understand that their contribution is really going to make a difference in identifying the disease early and finding better treatments. They're extremely motivated. So they do all kinds of very fancy things, like lots of imaging, brain imaging with MRI and what we call positron emission tomography, PET scans. They get lumbar punctures, so we collect cerebrospinal fluid, we collect blood. Of course, we do lots of clinical and cognitive assessments, and it's all with the idea that maybe we can put this information together to say when people are normal, who in 5 years might develop the disease, and therefore who we would want to intervene with.
And you described that Johns Hopkins offers infrastructure for the investigators. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Well, we have people who we follow annually. So we have about 500 people who are evaluated each year. And we make those people available to other investigators. So if somebody gets a grant, they can say, oh, well, there are 100 people with mild cognitive impairment in the Alzheimer Center, and we can recruit them for a study. So that's just one example. We collect a lot of imaging and fluid samples from these subjects. We make that available. We follow people to autopsy, and we make the brain tissue available, which is extremely valuable. And then we do a lot of training. We help people learn how to conduct research. We do a lot of training with young people. And one of the most wonderful things about all this money that's now available for Alzheimer's disease research is that it is really inspiring young people. It's making many, many more people go into the field, and that's what we need for the future. Even if we have an effective treatment in 2025, it's not going to be the whole answer. So it's the whole range of things that we do to try to move the field forward. And all the Alzheimer centers around the country, the other 29, they do similar things.
Oh, so the 30 don't have very specific things that they work on. Everybody is essentially doing.
Each one can choose.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Each one has an area of interest or specialty. For example, prior to NIA, I was for the past 30 years at the University of California, San Diego, that also had one of the very first Alzheimer centers with Hopkins. And there were 5 initially. And for example, we conducted research on dementia with Lewy bodies and Alzheimer's disease, but each center has an area of specialty. But what is important is that we also have what is called a National Alzheimer Coordinating Center that is based in Seattle at the University of Washington, that actually brings all the work done by each of the centers together. In a way in which all the data that is collected by every center is done in a standardized manner. And all that data is given to the coordinating center in Seattle, where all these data then is made publicly available to anybody that wants to perform research on Alzheimer's disease. So, for example, even though at each of the centers specific research is conducted, they also do standardized things. For example, studies of cognition, or studies of the imaging studies of the brain, or the pathology of the brain. All of that is made on all the centers in a standardized manner, and again, that information is sent to NAC, where then it's made available for everybody for research. Another very important function of the Alzheimer Center is that they also provide samples for genetic studies of Alzheimer's disease. And again, that also goes to a centralized repository and for analysis. And then again, that data goes to a center for distribution to all the research community that is interested on this work. So, and then like that, I can describe many other functions of the centers, for example, involving recruitment for clinical trials, and also training, as Dr. Albert mentioned at the beginning. We need to train the next generation that is going to be doing this work. And the Alzheimer's centers, like for example, one at Hopkins, made a wonderful job essentially at inspiring and training the next generation of scientists that are going to be working on these problems.
And I think it's sort of implicit in what Dr. Masliah has been saying, is that one of the remarkable things is how much we share and coordinate things together. We all meet together twice a year. We all know each other. If anybody needs anything, they get on the phone, they send an email. This is a gigantic problem, and we all know that if we don't work together, we're not going to be able to solve it.
The National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center, the NAC as you call it, is there data there for them to download and use? Is it understandable to a layperson?
You can request the data. You would have to, it's actual data, right? So it's actual test scores or information about pathological findings or what have you. But if you have a scientific expertise, you can request the data and they will send it to you.
And how many investigators are working at these centers across the United States? And do you know how many then people they're working with?
So at Hopkins, I would guess maybe it's between 150 and 200 investigators. At our center, as I say, we follow 500, but then there are all these other studies. There are maybe 40, 50 other studies going on at any one time that are also recruiting individuals. So it's a very, very large number of people and a very large number of individuals we're trying to recruit for research.
Yeah.
So is Johns Hopkins one of the larger ones, or are they all sort of equal?
They're similar in size. I would say one of the advantages that we have is that we have a very wide catchment area, and there are no other centers that are near us. And so that helps a lot.
Really? On the Mid-Atlantic? Really?
Yes.
Wow. Dr. Masliah, describe the importance of biomarkers.
Right. So biomarker means relatively, hopefully, rapid and easy test to be able to diagnose the disease, hopefully in earlier stages, even earlier than when the clinical symptoms appear. I think the classical biomarker is, for example, cholesterol and its relationship to atherosclerosis and heart disease, or blood sugar and its relationship to diabetes. On Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, the hope is to precisely develop this type of very reliable, fast, almost a blood test type of marker, which will tell us about the disease as early as possible. At the moment, most of the biomarkers that we have of the disease are in the way of imaging studies of the brain that will help detect the size of parts of the brain or the volume of certain areas of the brain, or find the presence or accumulation of certain proteins on the brain that are considered the hallmark of the disease. We have two proteins that are very much interested on. One is called amyloid beta protein and the other one is tau. And we currently have markers for these proteins that we can image in the brain. Now, the idea is that to have a faster and easier way to detect these proteins, so there has been quite a bit of work done measuring these proteins in cerebrospinal fluid, which involves obviously a spinal tap that could be invasive. So the idea is, well, can we develop something in terms of a blood marker? And I'm very excited to say that there has been tremendous progress in the last few years in that regard. We don't really have that yet, but I think there's tremendous progress, and hopefully very soon we'll have those markers. Now,
can you quantify very soon?
Yeah. I hope that it would be within the next year or two, actually.
Okay.
You know, why is this important? Because what we have realized with Alzheimer's disease is that the sooner we detect it, the earlier we detect it, and the sooner we start treating, the more likely is the possibility of being successful. Now, we're talking about detecting the disease before the symptoms of decline, of cognitive decline are seen.
Do the biomarkers have to go through a clinical process as well, or?
Well, what happens is that people come up with a finding and then other investigators try to replicate it, or you take that finding and you try to replicate it in another group of individuals. I mean, implicit in what Dr. Masliah is saying is that ideally we would look at the brain tissue, right, and say this is the disease. But we don't do that. We don't take biopsies of the brain. So we need these indirect measures of the pathology of the brain. And as Dr. Masliah was saying, we know that amyloid and tau are connected to the pathology. We have these markers in cerebrospinal fluid, now also in imaging, but it would be perfect if we had it in blood, because then that would be the easiest thing. But also we know that there are other markers that have to be found. So one of the interests at Johns Hopkins is to find synaptic markers or markers of inflammation, which we also know are important, because all of these things work together to, we know, accelerate the disease. So maybe you have one or two markers, but those alone are not enough to mean that in 5 years or 10 years you're going to have the disease. But if you have all four of them, then maybe that's the time that you would intervene. That's the kind of work that we're trying to do.
And once they discover, is that the right word, a reliable marker, is that the kind of thing that would just become part of routine annual testing?
That actually takes a lot of work to get it to that point. So if you go in and you have a PSA test or test of cholesterol, it's taken an enormous amount of effort to get it to the point where you can go into a laboratory and a measure anywhere will mean the same thing. So for example, in the area of cerebrospinal fluid, there's been a big international consortium sending samples of cerebrospinal fluid around the world and having it tested in various laboratories, because we know that there's a difference if we measure it in our laboratory or if they measure it in Philadelphia or New York or California. And so standardizing those measures is one of the big challenges that we have.
A journalist is asking, please discuss diversity among participants in clinical trials and other studies about dementia. And I know there are some statistics in general about demographics in dementia. Can one of you address those?
Well, we know from statistics that people from minority populations, people who are African American or Hispanic in particular in this country, are more likely to develop dementia than Caucasians. We believe, although we don't know for sure, that most of it is because they have combinations of dementia, particularly vascular disease. They have a higher prevalence of that. And that combined with Alzheimer pathology is one of the reasons that they cross that threshold for dementia sooner, because they have more general disease. But there may also be genetic differences, all kinds of other things that haven't been explored. And one of the big challenges that we've all had is enrolling minority populations in clinical trials and in research in general. And one of the major efforts that we've all undertaken is to try to make a difference in that. So just as an example, in the Alzheimer Center programs, we all make a big effort to have outreach to minority communities, to educate them more about dementia and other forms, and Alzheimer's disease in particular, and to help them to understand why it's so important for them to participate in clinical research and clinical trials.
And how do you do that outreach? Do you have some concrete examples?
So at Johns Hopkins, we've had a Memory and Aging Community Advisory Board that we established in 2004. It's made up of members of the minority community, some people who were affected by the disease, some people who are involved in healthcare activities in the community, many people who are active in their local environment, so for example, their churches, and they have become committed to helping to educate the population and to encourage people to participate in research. So if they get up at a community event and say, you know, it's really important for us to participate, because how are they going to be able to figure out how to treat our population if we don't participate? That's just worth everything.
Yeah. So what other efforts are there to develop early and accurate diagnoses of Alzheimer's?
Well, we've been sort of talking about it. It's particularly related to this issue of biomarkers and to following people longitudinally. So you have to take people who are normal or who have mild cognitive impairment, study them in great detail with these biomarkers and with cognitive testing and clinical assessments, and then see if you can figure out if combining that information together will tell you what's going to happen to somebody in a few years' time. From what we've learned from our studies, it seems as if no one particular measure is going to be the answer. It's going to be combining them together. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been putting imaging data, cerebrospinal fluid data, cognitive data all together and statistically trying to see what that tells us about the future. And we're assuming that if tomorrow a drug was approved for Alzheimer's disease, it wouldn't be benign. It would have side effects. And so you would want to give it to people who really are at risk. And that's the primary basis for trying to improve early diagnosis.
Let's move on to pharmaceuticals. So Dr. Masliah, can you tell us a sort of state of where the pharmaceutical industry is on dementia?
Well, I can talk to you from the standpoint of...
I'm sorry, not the pharmaceutical, not the industry.
Represent them.
Right, exactly. Okay, so...
But I know what you mean. So, yeah, there has been a tremendous push, and in big part thanks to what Dr. Albert described, because of the tremendous progress both in understanding the pathogenesis, the mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease, and because of the development of biomarkers, and now developing what we call disease-modifying therapies of Alzheimer's disease. And that means that the treatment goes to the root cause of the disease and will attack that, so we can not only relieve the symptoms, but also stop or at least control the disease. At the moment, most of the focus has been on two targets. So I mentioned them, amyloid and tau. But also there is tremendous effort on trying to identify novel targets for the treatment of the disease that not only will address these specific pathways, but also other pathways involving, for example, as Dr. Albert mentioned, inflammation, or addressing the dysregulation of some emotions or psychiatric symptoms. Psychiatric symptoms are really a very important component of the disease that need to be addressed. I mean, of course, thinking, cognition is also important, memory is important, but also all these other symptoms like psychiatric alterations are very important to address. So at NIA, we're funding a number of investigators in the U.S. To conduct clinical trials, both trying to address the root cause of the disease, but also to address some of these symptoms. At the moment, we have 140 clinical trials that NIA is sponsoring, both on utilizing drugs, but also utilizing non-pharmacological approaches, and also addressing issues of care. Care and caregivers are also very important in this equation, and we're also sponsoring caregiving type of trials for Alzheimer's disease. But this is, I want to say, this is just small in comparison to the size of the problem and the challenge that is going to be to bring more patients and more individuals on board for these clinical trials. I mean, this is just the beginning, so we need to amplify these considerably.
Mm-hmm. And one of the big challenges that we have in the field of dementia is that it's a disease that progresses very slowly. And so many of these trials have to be very long. Mm-hmm. So in a cancer trial, you might have a trial that lasts 6 months, perhaps. Trials in preclinical Alzheimer's disease last 5 years. The standard trial in mild cognitive impairment lasts at least 18 months. Mm-hmm. So this is a big commitment for the person to be involved in, and it takes a very, very long time to get an answer to know if you're on the right track. So it's very, very challenging.
Mm-hmm. So there are 140 clinical trials underway through NIA.
Right.
What else is being done in the U.S. or by other countries that would be of note for our journalist audience?
Well, the pharmaceutical companies have mm-hmm. enormous efforts in this area.
Mm-hmm.
I often tell lay audiences that while the terrible thing about Alzheimer's disease is that it's so common, the good thing is that it's so common because the pharmaceutical companies are working on it. Mm-hmm. There are lots of terrible diseases that companies are not working on. Mm-hmm. So there are major trials all around the world that are being led. Increasingly, as we've been saying, looking at people in earlier and earlier stages of the disease, but mostly trying to find ways of really modifying the underlying pathology that causes the disease.
And if a journalist wanted to look at the pharmaceutical clinical trials, is there a good resource for them to go to?
Well, trials.gov
right.
is where they're all listed.
Great.
And also the website of the Alzheimer's Association lists many of these trials.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about recruitment efforts for clinical trials. Is there anything beyond what you described, the length of time and finding people in the preclinical stage that would be of interest to journalists?
This is really one of the major challenges that we have. I mean, of course, we have a number of challenges. As we mentioned, discover new biomarkers, discover what we call more shots on goal, that is new targets for the disease. But sure, we can discover more targets for the disease, we can discover more biomarkers, but we're going to need more individuals participating in those clinical trials. It is estimated that we're probably going to need at least 50,000 new participants on the trials. And even to recruit for one of these preventive type of studies, let's say 4,000, we need to start from a base of at least 250,000 people. So you can imagine that the size of the problem is quite staggering. And as Dr. Alba mentioned, for the kind of clinical studies that we want to run, we want participants in a very early stage or normal. A lot of them are actually normal individuals. So with this in mind, NIA in combination with the Alzheimer's Association, also against Alzheimer's, and many others in the community, including Hopkins and many other participants, created a national strategy to address participation for clinical studies in Alzheimer's disease, not only clinical trials, but also natural history and epidemiological studies. So we released our national strategy early in the fall. We made this publicly available on our website. We invited for commentaries from the general public. We got a tremendous response, and we're now in the phase of working together with all our partners, as I said, in the private industry, nonprofit groups, academia, and many others to put in place this plan and find ways, innovative ways of bringing more people to participate in trials. But I mean, it's quite clear that the efforts at the local level, so this is not only just like a big campaign with many ads on the TV, it's really all working together and working at the local level to recruit. So it's one participant at a time. You know, it's going to be a big challenge, but again, we're all working together. And also I invite your colleagues to look at the plan that we put out there if they are interested.
So one of the interesting approaches that has been taken is to develop registries. There are at least 3 that I can think of right now: the Brain Health Registry, the Alzheimer Prevention Initiative, and the Trial Match, which is run by the Alzheimer's Association. And they were all designed to bring people in with the idea that they will get information about the disease, but then if a trial is recruiting, they can provide information to people and tell them what they're looking for and where you can go if you want to participate. Just this last week at Johns Hopkins, ADNI, which is still continuing to enroll, had an article in the local newspaper, and our phone was ringing off the hook, so, which is good, but it takes that level of effort in order to make a difference.
Right. We've got another question here asking you to discuss the importance of early onset Alzheimer's.
So early onset Alzheimer's disease is fortunately very rare. It means that the disease is developing in people, technically it's under the age of 65, but some people develop it in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s. Right at the moment, there are 2 large sets of clinical trials going on with these populations. So we were talking about it before. There's one very large cohort of thousands of people that live in Central America and in South America, in Colombia, where there's a clinical trial in people who have a mutation but haven't yet developed the symptoms. And so this is the ultimate test of whether or not the particular type of drug that's being used can make a difference in the disease. These are people, of course, who are enormously disabled very young, and a lot of the resources that are available for older people are not available for them. We follow one very large family that I've known for many years, and their mother had Alzheimer's disease before it was understood to be a problem, and when she would bring them to school, she would forget to pick them up. And she didn't know how to, nobody understood what was going on. I mean, you can imagine what this must be for a family. So it's an unusual burden, early onset disease, which is fortunately, as I say, not very common.
How can genetics improve understanding and lead to new therapies for dementia?
Yeah, I think genetics definitely hold a lot of the the knowledge that we need to defeat this disease. And it has become quite clear that a complex genetic component is behind what we call let's say the garden variety of Alzheimer's disease, late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is in a way somewhat different to what Dr. Albert was describing as early onset Alzheimer's disease. Most of early onset Alzheimer's disease are these familial cases that are related to a mutation that causes the disease in a dominant inherited way. There is another set of complex genetics forms of Alzheimer's, which is early onset, which is not a single mutation, but could be many different genetic causes. But then we have like the great majority of the Alzheimer's cases, let's say over 80-90%, which has this combination of environmental, health, lifestyle, risk factors, and genetics. So it's not that it's only the genes or the environment, but it's the combination of the two working together. And we at NIA fund a large consortium that is called ADSP, for Alzheimer's Disease Sequencing Program, which is currently sequencing with great detail over 30,000 individuals, control and Alzheimer's disease. And many of them recruited to the Alzheimer centers, like the Alzheimer centers that Dr. Alba heads at Hopkins. And where the genetic underpinnings of Alzheimer's disease are being discovered. A very exciting finding of these studies is that, for example, genes involved in inflammation appear to be very prominent for the disease. Also, genes involved in the metabolism of lipids, in the signaling of molecules that are involved in connections in the brain are also very important. So as we identify these genes, we understand how they work, we can hopefully develop new therapies. And of course, these genes represent novel targets for therapeutics for the disease.
And they also represent potentially novel biomarkers. So the idea that you identify inflammation as being important in the genes, then you look for markers of inflammation, and then that might help you to identify people or track response to treatment. All of that is kind of connected.
And the other thing to take into consideration is that, of course, these studies look at the gene, which is one component, but the gene, to have its effect, has to be converted into a protein. So there are efforts underway. We have a program that is called Accelerated Medicines Program for Alzheimer's disease, or AMP-AD, that is doing precisely that, looking at how the gene information correlates with the protein and with the behavior and other biomarkers in those individuals. So combining all that very complex data and trying to understand at what we call systems biology approach the disease, which is something that the cancer field has been doing very successfully in the last 10 years, as well as the cardiovascular field. I mean, the cardiovascular field understood very rapidly that it's not only cholesterol or genes involved in cholesterol, but that you have to understand how the network of these genes and proteins and behavior and cells, how they are interacting, how they are integrated, and how they are doing what they are doing. So that's one of the major efforts undergoing right now.
And Dr. Albert, what is the potential for precision medicine?
Well, it's related to this same question.
Right,
so if
from
you
genetics.
understood somebody's genetics, if you understood the stage of the disease they were at, was it preclinical, MCI, if you understood the various pathologies they had, then you might be able to ultimately find a treatment that would be right for that person. I mean, we see it now playing out in cancer. We see that people look at the type of tumor, the stage of the tumor, other genetic factors that are relevant, and they try to develop treatments that are targeted for that individual. And that's the hope that we have for Alzheimer's disease. If we can identify all these factors that are influencing the progression of the disease, then we can find treatments that are targeted.
Did you have anything to add?
Well, before the program started, you were asking us about the summits and the meetings that we have every year to address the questions that are burning in the minds of the research community in Alzheimer's disease. And this year, our NIH-sponsored summit that happened in Bethesda in March was focused on the question of developing a precision medicine approach for Alzheimer's disease. Is something that is very much in the minds of everybody, and I think developing the infrastructure to generate data at many levels that becomes publicly available, where others could also mine that data and look at that data and work together with the community, I think would advance that precision medicine approach. And that's an area that we're working very hard on.
And just as an example, at Johns Hopkins, one of the things that the university is doing is trying to use the information in the medical records of patients that might give us some clues as to how to intervene early, who's likely to have a more rapid decline, different types of diseases. If you can get a large enough database, which of course all major medical systems have, then maybe you can discern patterns that we can't get from even the very large amounts of data that we have at the Alzheimer centers.
Let's discuss lifestyle factors and how that might influence cognitive decline.
So this is one of the questions we get all the time. I often talk to lay audiences about Alzheimer's disease, and they sit and they listen, and then when I start talking about lifestyle factors, they start taking notes. So the interest in this began years ago with large longitudinal studies following people over time and seeing what lifestyle factors predicted maintenance of cognitive function. And those early studies then led to clinical trials, because the early studies identified things like cognitive activity, physical activity, social engagement, control of vascular risks. But the question was, were these real? Were these real findings? They had to be followed with randomized clinical trials. And more recently, there have been a whole series of trials like that. There was a report from the National Academy of Medicine evaluating these trials, and they came up saying three things: that the information on cognitive activity, cognitive training seemed to be promising, physical activity, being physically active, both stretching and also aerobic activity, and also treating blood pressure in midlife. All of those things seem to be promising approaches. That's just based on the data that was available at the time the study was done. But there's an enormous interest in this area, and one of the groups that has been, I think, spearheading the information for the general public is the Global Council on Brain Health that's sponsored by AARP. And what they've been doing is convening groups of experts to say, what do we know? What do we know about sleep? What do we know about nutrition? What do we know about clinical trials or vascular risks? And then putting that information on their website, but in a way that's really very user-friendly and helpful in terms of giving people advice about day-to-day function.
Again, I'm going to ask you a question on journalists' behalf. Where can people find more information about lifestyle factors that they can relay to their audience? You mentioned that.
I would point them to the Global Council on Brain Health website that's part of AARP, because there are a series of reports that have now been available. You can download them. They give a consensus statement, but what I think is the most valuable thing is that they also give people clues about what they can do in their daily life that might be helpful.
And in general, for reporters covering dementia issues, are there other resources that you would point them to I believe you mentioned 2 organizations that have annual meetings. Could you tell the audience what those are
Well,
again?
the Alzheimer's Association has a website, alz.org, which is a resource we always send people to.
Yeah, and then the NIA website that you saw on the introductory video also has information, of course, on healthy aging, but also on brain aging, Alzheimer's disease, and all these other programs that we've been talking about.
And the CDC also has developed a program looking at healthy aging and lifestyle factors, and they have information as well on their website.
Anything else to add as we wind down here?
Well, everybody's working very hard to make a difference. We were saying earlier that we're optimistic. Nobody thought Alzheimer's disease was a disease of importance until really 35 years ago. And then it became clear that it was a common disease and that it was the most common cause of dementia. And now, all these years later, we know a lot about the basic biology. We don't yet have effective treatments, but we have enormous amounts of funding that are clearly going to make a difference. So I think we have reason to be optimistic.
Right, and I think we have the organization, the infrastructure, and the will among the community come together and work together, trying to solve these problems. We're also incredibly positive and excited about the prospects, and we'll continue working together.
Okay, great. So our thanks again to Dr. Eliezer Masliah, Director of the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute on Aging, and Dr. Marilyn S, Director of the Division of Cognitive Neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins University. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.